in actual fact, I do know that in one instance, the family of one of the children had given up the child for dead. She has been missing for years, and so they thought she was deceased. Fortunately, they did come forward, but if you believe your child is dead and the call is made for parents of missing children to come forward, you might not respond to that. Not only that, I think parents and caregivers are quite fearful. They're fearful sometimes of some kind of retributive act on the part of the traffickers, because this is an area in which intimidation is rife. And they're also fearful of what will their child be like? Will they be able to cope with this child if it is their child? Will the child ever be able to be reintegrated back into the family and community? So there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear.
But Joan, is there any other reason to believe that these children disappear for any other reason other than trafficking? Or should we conclude that they disappear simply because of this phenomenon of trafficking?
Well, sometimes children abscond and are picked up by traffickers. And so may have had very difficult relationships with their families before they were actually trafficked. But the other thing that we have done research on as an organization in association with the Human Rights League of Mozambique is the movement of children for the harvesting of body parts. Now, this is also a form of trafficking that we are very concerned about. And so yes, children disappear for a whole variety of reasons, over and above just simple trafficking for sexual exploitation.
All right. I'll talk to the professor about then the sociology of all of this. But Marija, from the IOM's point of view, what information, what stats do you have that perhaps may indicate to us whether this phenomenon is on an increase or not?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, loud and clear. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Actually, having statistics related to trafficking in persons in general, including trafficking in children, still remains a daunting task. It's because of the clandestine nature of the phenomenon, and the victims are normally exploited behind closed doors and therefore remain invisible. As IOM, in terms of statistics, we can only talk from the experience and actually from the actual assistance provided to, or direct assistance provided to the victims of human trafficking. And we're talking about, for the past 7 years, at 380 victims assisted, including children.
What condition do you find these victims in?
Usually, the trafficking cases that we have assisted in the past years were mainly for the purposes of sexual exploitation, but we did came across with victims, especially children, that were trafficked for the purposes of domestic labor.
Where do you find them?
As an organization, we are not a law enforcement agency, but we are victim-centered and victim-orientated. We work very closely with relevant departments, government departments, that are referring the cases to us, but also with respective NGOs and church organizations. Then the potential victims are referred to us. We go through the process of screening, interview, and identification following established international standards. And determination is then being made, again, based on the fully informed consent of the person that we're interviewing. And then this person is being placed into a place of safety if it's a child, or a shelter that is managed and operated by an NGO or Department for Social Development. And then the whole process of tracing the family in the place of origin or a country of origin if it's a foreign victim or a child. Where we look into the situations, or situation of the family, or situation that may lead for this child, for example, to be trafficked. And then was the family somehow involved in the whole trafficking process? And
what does that mean? I mean, how do families get involved?
Usually unintentionally, or because of lack of information or awareness, and they're being deceived by the recruiters. And like a well-known person in the community will go to a mother and say, I can provide a better education for your child, or maybe a job that will pay a certain amount of money. It's just, why don't you allow for this child to join me? And then the child is being taken. Again, nothing from promises has been fulfilled, and instead this child has been exploited for different purposes.
Just another question before again I go to the professor. Do you find that most of the people that you have interviewed and spoken to are locals? In other words, are they South Africans, or are they coming outside from other countries? From
our caseload, the majority of the cases are the foreign victims of trafficking, though we have dealt with South Africans as well. And again, that's not really an indicator that trafficking for different types of exploitation of foreign victims is on increase or is the major problem in South Africa. I want to emphasize that again, that leads into maybe a lack of identification systems or processes throughout the country, and maybe not having enough knowledge that the trafficking actually is happening in South Africa, and the South Africans are targeted as well.
Okay. All right. Professor, let me bring you in then. Please talk to us about the work that you do in this area.
Well, I've been interested in trafficking for a number of years. It just caught my attention when someone asked me to write a paper, and when investigating was just horrified at what I was seeing, how many countries were involved, which is virtually every country in one way or the other. But just to get back onto why is trafficking happening, and first of all, it's generally acknowledged to be a crime that generates quite high profits, and there's a very low risk of detection. And of course, trafficking covers a multitude of crimes, and some of these have been touched on by Joan and Marija. It's the trafficking for sexual exploitation, the removal of body parts, organ trafficking. There's also, of course, pornography, and labor trafficking. Most of the research attention has been focused on trafficking of women and children for sexual exploitation. One has to look at the push and pull factors, or the demand. There is a demand for these types of cheap labor, so to speak, or free labor, so to speak, and this is exacerbated by the vulnerabilities of many of these people. The poverty is generally acknowledged to be one of the greatest factors that make people vulnerable. Also, there's that element of deceit that's been touched on, and there's also a large amount of ignorance. And I think there's a case in Pretoria now of girls that were recruited by an employment agency to work in clubs in Turkey. When they got there, they were told they were expected to provide sexual favors to the clients. Here, we're not talking about poverty as a driver, but certainly of ignorance and deceit in recruiting as well. In recruiting, yes.
But let's talk. One of the things you say is, of course, profits, low rates of detection. Does that mean that the police are ineffective in dealing with these crimes?
I don't think that they're ineffective. I just think that a lot. It's very difficult to identify a crime of trafficking, and I think there's been a lot of training, but not. There needs to be more training of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, to deal with trafficking. I think, as I understand it now, there is also no mandatory obligation by social workers to report a crime of trafficking to the police. I think a lot more training, but what has been encouraging is I've been seeing more and more reports in the media of suspected trafficking cases where these cases have been identified as possible trafficking cases, whereas before a lot of them were simply reported as cases of sexual abuse, prostitution, labor exploitation, or whatever. So I think that a lot of the anti-trafficking advocacy that was done in the run-up to the World Cup, unfortunately, we didn't have the numbers that were predicted, but a lot of the advocacy has made people all aware. So I think we need a growing awareness of the problem, more training.
But does it really deal with the problem? Because ultimately, the courts must also be able to deal with these matters. You may have a society that is very well aware, but you take the matters to court, the legislative environment perhaps may be lacking or not ready to deal with these matters.
They are already there, although we don't have the overarching legislation there. I think, as Marija pointed out, there's the provision of trafficking in the Sexual Offences Act, also in the Children's Act. There are also a number of other laws under which trafficking offences can be prosecuted. It is just a matter of proper investigations, of awareness training, proper investigations of both law enforcement and prosecutors.